If you have been paying attention to the tech industry as of late, you may have heard of Apple cutting production orders for all the new iPhones as they aren't selling as well as expected. Apple's shares have been going down and Microsoft actually passed them in market value, although that could and probably will change at some point. But still, considering how well Apple has historically done, especially with iPhones, you gotta wonder, what's happening here? And is this downward trend going to continue? Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and today we're asking the question, why aren't people buying iPhones? Now, for the record, people are still buying iPhones. While Apple isn't making record sales, they're still doing extremely well and are probably outselling most, if not all, other flagships. As well as that, smartphone sales in general right now are on the decline, not just with Apple, despite the general narrative at the moment. However, Apple is indeed feeling a hit, with them lowering production of both the iPhone XS and XR. Plus, it sounds like they might be bringing 2017's iPhone X back, at least to select markets, and if so, why? Is this year's model that much of a failure? But before we get to that, we do have a quick word from today's sponsor, iSkysoft. iSkysoft Toolbox allows you to repair and fix iOS issues by yourself, so you don't have to pay someone to do it for you. iSkysoft is free to download and offers a plethora of solutions to various issues you might have with your iPhone. This actually does make data recovery and transfers easier than, say, with iTunes, a program that frankly is way too confusing, way too much of the time. If iSkysoft is something that interests you, make sure you check it out by clicking the top link in the description below and giving it a download. Alright, so there are a few reasons for the so-called poor sales when it comes to iPhones. Firstly, most people are on a 2-year cycle with phones. They'll sign a contract and then upgrade in a couple years. The iPhone X last year was a huge upgrade, and as such, a lot of people jumped on board, thus committing to the phone until 2019 or 2020. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't a defense or an excuse at all, but it is a factor. More people jumped on the iPhone X than, say, the iPhone 7, so it would make sense if less people are ready to make the upgrade to the XS. The releases of the new iPhones have probably confused people too. In September, the new iPhone came out, and then a month later, another iPhone came out. If you're not knowledgeable in tech, that would be pretty confusing, and rightly so. Apple should have released the XS and the XR at the same time, especially because they released the worst model a month after the best model. The iPhone X did have to be delayed last year, but it actually worked out pretty well, because it waited almost 2 months to come out after the iPhone 8, and was also a significant and noticeable upgrade, unlike the XR, which is actually a downgrade, but with a lower price tag. One of the most important things to remember here is that the average buyer of any smartphone really doesn't know what they're buying, so if you confuse the consumer in any way, like they've done with the XR, then you're going to cause some problems. That said, the iPhone XR apparently is the best-selling iPhone right now, as people have began to adjust, so take that as you will. Give it a few months and people will start to get used to the idea of multiple iPhone options, and I'm guessing we'll see a pretty big increase in sales. But even so, in the short term, Apple kind of shot themselves in the foot, or at least the toe, considering iPhones are still selling really well, as they always do. When talking about Apple and apparent poor sales, it is important to note that saying poor is relative. Apple is the industry leader for a reason and is outselling basically every other flagship out there. But still, if this downward trend is going to continue, again, you gotta wonder, is this going to be the start of the downfall of Apple? No, it's not, and if you think it is, then, well, have fun. Apple is going to be just fine. But let's look at the iPhone XR for a moment here. The XS maybe not selling well kind of makes sense, given that it was such a small upgrade over the X, but the XR is a fairly good valued phone, at least for Apple, so why is it still not selling as well as it should be? Again, there was limited enthusiasm for its launch, as it was kind of confusing being a month after the XS, but I think it's also because it's still a huge step up for a lot of people with no home button and no Face ID, and people don't always like change. The iPhone 8 and 8 Plus, on the other hand, are both cheaper and are familiar to people. So for now, they're really cannibalizing the sales of the more futuristic XR. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because Apple makes money regardless. So let's be real. The reasoning for Apple's slower sales isn't just because of the confusing release, but it's because people don't want to buy new iPhones right now. At least not as much as they usually do. I consider myself a bit of a pessimist at times, and I can see that outlook here. This doesn't reflect well on Apple, especially with them now not reporting iPhone sales. Back in the iPhone 6 days when Apple was selling the most they've ever sold, most people still had an iPhone 4, 4S, and even a 5. That said, I think there's another valid reason that people aren't buying iPhones right now, and it's actually a good reason. And it's because of something Apple's doing that nobody else is doing, and that's supporting their phones for so long. Back in the iPhone 6 days when Apple were making their most sales ever, most people still had an iPhone 4, 4S, and even the 5, phones that were starting to feel outdated in 2014, 2015. Back then, phones didn't last as long. The iPhone 4 got its last update in 2013, despite only coming out in 2010. Nowadays, iPhones last much longer than they used to. The iPhone 5S came out in 2013 and is still fully supported today and will be throughout the majority of 2019. That's 6 years of updates in a smartphone, and that's part of the reason I think Apple feels higher prices are justified. It's a longer term investment than smartphones ever used to be, and that is something I'll get to. iPhones are more expensive than ever right now. If you bought the iPhone 4, you were looking at about 3 years of usability before the thing was just too slow. Nowadays, you can get an easy 5 years if you replace the battery at some point. That's absolutely insane, and it's part of the reason I'm somewhat okay with Apple's high prices. Don't get me wrong, I still think $1,000 is too much for an iPhone, but when you take into account that not only will the phone retain its value pretty well, it also will be fully usable for at least 6 years. 6 years is a really long time, and I mean, think about it. People often go through cars more often than every 6 years, and the fact that a phone can last that long is pretty crazy. So steering to that high price, well, I don't like it. Actually, I hate it. I wish iPhones still costed $800. I think that was a pretty good point for them. I'd say that you are paying for longevity. Unlike the similarly priced Note 9, a phone that'll get maybe 2 or 3 years of updates, and to add to that, updates that come out months and months after Google releases them, the iPhone 10 and 10s are going to be supported for a really long time, and chances are the hardware will give out on you before the software does. People just don't need to upgrade their iPhones as much as they used to, and that's actually a good thing. Bad for Apple's sales numbers, but good for the consumer. The consumer would rather keep their iPhone that is still performing decently instead of buying something that'll clean out their bank account, and that makes sense. So while this will, and I think is hurting Apple's sales in the short term, their user base should continue to grow more and more as people jump into the system. There's a very high percentage of iPhones sold that go to people who already owned iPhones, but with iPhones lasting longer, it would make more sense. You're getting a higher percentage of people who didn't used to own an iPhone buying iPhones for the first time. The 10 hours a phone meant to make that initial leap into the Apple ecosystem just a little bit easier, but in my opinion, it's still just a little bit too expensive for most people. However, I think Apple knows this, and there are rumors that there actually could be price cuts. If Apple made the 10R even $50 cheaper, I would say that it would be without a doubt the best value smartphone you could buy. That's right, I think it would be better value than the OnePlus 6T. I wouldn't say that now, but if it was $700, I would, because the OnePlus 6T is not going to be supported for nearly as long. The 10R would be impossible to argue against, especially if you prefer iPhones, and so if they decide to actually cut prices all across the board, that will only be a good thing. That said, it's Apple, and to my knowledge, Apple has never cut prices mid-year for a new iPhone, and so I highly doubt anything will actually come of this. If Apple lowered their prices, I would be shocked. I really don't think it's going to happen. Apple does need to work on a lot of things. With their stock and sales plummeting, maybe they should be worried. But at the same time, how many times over the years have we heard that Apple is doomed? If Apple was doomed as many times as people said, we might still be using flip phones. And I'm only half joking. Apple has the knack to stick around, and the millions of iOS users aren't just going to disappear. So to summarize this video, this whole situation isn't just as black and white as Apple is failing right now, and that iPhones aren't selling because they're overpriced. It's much more convoluted than that, and while Apple might be hurting right now in the short term, even not reporting their current sales again, which I think is an awful move, this will all pass. And I'd be willing to bet that Apple will reclaim the crown of being the world's most valuable company, even if it doesn't happen in the near future. But I'm just one fool who bought the newest iPhone. What do you think? Comment your thoughts down below. Let's try to keep this civil, folks. I know for some reason people like to treat tech like politics, but it isn't, so let's try to have a good conversation going down there. Also, make sure you check out iSkySoft Toolbox, link in the description. It's free to download, so why not give it a try, right? If you found this video interesting, maybe hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. You can follow me over on Twitter Twitter and Instagram if you want some more tech in your life, links below. And with that all being said, I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.